Hello. So today I'm going to talk about chapters 8 and 9, since these were not too long of chapters and the analyses I had is just for these two, so it's not too much. But chapter 8 is about elites in the UK and the structure behind them in the UK political system. And chapter 9 is about the voting system in the UK and just the trends that we notice in the UK. So chapter 8 goes into the elites in the UK and highlights that they are the skilled professionals in their fields, usually at the highest rank because of these skills. So it used to be in the UK that there was a more merit-based skill system that only came into existence from the Chinese examination system that was introduced in the early 19th century, and this was from something that elites benefited from the most. So political parties were interestingly highlighted as not necessarily choosing their candidates on merits, but more on impressions. So in that way, elitism isn't the only criteria in this way. So the UK, so when we're studying elites, it's best that we especially study the merits and the social mobility, as these two look into how, when you're studying the merits, what makes one an elite, just how good of a skill, how is your skill in this field, and the social mobility is the movement to become an elite. How feasible is it to become an elite? So the UK has had a history of being an extremely class-based society, with elites versus the working class being the predominant characteristic. But recent prime ministers have tried to institute a more meritocratic society where class does not matter too much to become successful or to become an elite. From a historical standpoint, compared to how the UK was in the 19th century, this has worked, and there has been much more egalitarian ways and more social mobility, which is why social mobility matters in this context. So social mobility reached this fluid stage by the World War II, where it was especially the white-collar service transition economy, and a lot of school-age examinations that gave students higher education was also a prevalent thing at the time. But it actually has been on a decline, especially since the years of Thatcher's premiership, as mobility became difficult, with those at the top becoming more concerned with maintaining the hierarchy, and thus has made it more harder for those in the bottom to even reach that level or try to reach the level. So by the financial crisis aftermath, the majority of Britons began to earn less than before, and this was according to studies that the book highlighted, and there were less. And those who were least socially mobile were, interestingly, more likely to vote in support of Brexit. So by the 2010s, many reports were looking into studying this phenomenon, as it found many upper middle class started having more disproportionate opportunities to become a part of the elites and the elite class, as the middle class has become more of a pool for elite advancement, especially the upper middle. So a helpful tool in this for getting to this level of becoming an elite has been education, it seems. So back then, actually, ministers of parliament didn't really complete the traditional education, as many dropped out early or would receive it through work associations and trade unions, as former Secretary of Foreign Affairs State Ernest Bevin did prior to World War II. So this whole rags to riches story was actually quite a common thing that was possible back then, and not as much as today, actually. So private education has been the promising educational route for elite opportunities and roles, which doesn't seem to be based off of brains necessarily as much as just wealth getting into these colleges. And of course, colleges like Eton, Oxford, and the Oxbridge or Cambridge also, they have made it even more exclusive and more harder to get into these elite schools from the pay and just the whole system of being not for all. So recent cabinets of recent governments many have been privately educated, including many famous actors and even footballers as well. So the development of super families, where those of an excellent opportunities, like in money and education, seem to be developing where they are marrying those of other similar statuses. So thus they are securing the elite privilege that they have of a very successful spouse, another very successful spouse making a baby, and they have that child also be very successful. And this only seems on track to continue. So fitting in with the elites is also an important thing that plays into one's favor for achieving these opportunities, by just being in the same room and being able to communicate with them. And not fitting in just makes it a little more difficult to advance. You have to be in with the group in order to get to that level. A 2019 study that the author also pointed out was looking into how nurture seems to be playing a bigger role than nature and why wealth remains across generations. So that whole idea of brains passed down doesn't seem true, as it seems that environment is more promising than just having the talent or the skill. And they were using through adopted and biological parents comparisons of their children to see this phenomenon. There's also the super rich in the UK that some see as a part of the elites, but even some others to see them as above them. Some of these have some political sway that is significant, especially in the Conservative Party, and it poses questions on their partisan concerns. But it's not just Conservative parties, as one example they highlighted was Rupert Murdoch was seen as a silent Minister of Parliament, always at Downing Street under Tony Blair's premiership. So overall, the elites being so scattered doesn't seem that they are coming together and going for these intended interests. It's just that they all seem to have the similar interests and power in their respective fields that do overlap. The author ended by highlighting another author, Owen Jones, and his book about elites, titled "Elites: How They Get Away with It." And he highlights this phrase that Jones said, that elites have a fundamental right-wing goals to strengthen unequal status. So chapter 9 looks into the voting system in the UK. So the UK has been following usually a first past the post system, similar to what we have in the US, especially from 1964 to 97, by giving the two parties clear hegemony, the Conservatives and Labour. Since then has been mixed at the local level, with some other third parties coming at local level government, but the House of Commons is not too strong in party diversity, but it has seen some gradual changes. So many Britons seem to be more concerned with general elections, or what we call first order elections, much more than the second order elections like mayoral races or just local government levels. And some of this seems to be, we're not sure if it's the cause or the effect of the media's highlighting of these more bigger national elections. So we're not exactly sure who to signify as the reason for this. Safer regions, including those who are more safely Conservative, safely Labour, have had lower voter turnout, it seems. Local elections, though, see more diversity in the parties, and they see more involvement in those local government levels, though. And those with more, as in with money, education, status, they seem to be voting more than those without like money, education, and all that. Which is unlike in the 1960s when those with a little more had more of a significant vote in the government. The youth have consistently voted at lower levels than the elderly, especially in terms with how we can see these two's relationship with time. The elderly have a lot of time, already being older, done all the things they needed in their life and work, whereas the youth don't seem to feel that they had that much time. It's almost seen that you can see in the cost and benefits argument, where because you don't see no clear result from your vote, you almost feel like this isn't really a cost-effective solution. And when your party doesn't win, it only feels even more worthless in that way. Normative motivation seems to be the motivating factor for voters, as it is seen that voters need to vote for a sense of duty that they have towards their nation. So party identification tends to result in voting, it seems, but there's been an increase in the lack of party identification, and we have seen lower voter turnout recently because of this, which is a very difficult problem to solve with no clear solution for any government, as this is also prevalent in other countries in the West. There's a prevalent theory of the southeast of England. This region has more political dominance than the rest of the country because the southeast is more prosperous, while the rest are not as prosperous, especially in the end of World War II as the deindustrialization efforts came in for the more service economy. Similar to the US patterns of voter preference and Labor's with Democrats and Conservatives with Republicans is that many renters or ethnic minorities tend to vote more for the Labour Party. Those who are owners or from the dominant white race groups, they seem to vote more for the Conservatives, it seems. The Butler-Stokes model was a model that used to be really relevant to measure the voting patterns through identification, at least amongst Britons. But this has not been the most valid anymore, and instead it seems that the valence voting model seems a little more significant and accurate to today's time. So the valence voting model is based on who votes, based on how people vote, not necessarily on the party identification, but just on how voters see which party is most competent with something, like immigration. So in this way, voters then look to individuals then to understand the party better. And what individuals do represents the party and makes it more easier for voters to understand. Party identification still matters in this model. It's just that it's more dynamic, as there is no necessarily status loyalty, especially in the age of information. When people have so much more information, they kind of form their own opinions rather than simply listening to what the conservatives or the Labor says. So this theory was actually tested before the 2015 elections to see voters' perception of competence. Many saw conservatives able to deal with the economy, and then we saw conservatives win in government. Yet the figure of David Cameron was still disliked, but those who did like him were more likely to vote for his party, though. There's also a brief part at the end of the chapter that looked into the 2017 elections, and this was tested again, and the valence theory seemed still prevalent, but didn't fully explain the big picture, including how Labor's approach to tuition fees, which wasn't widely agreed across the nations, has changed this model a bit. And the valence theory model suggests that there is still just a constantly changing theories in how we look into voting patterns and voting systems. So at one point I considered when reading this chapter of elites in the UK was, is the issue of elites in the UK an issue that can be resolved, like practically or even structurally? On the practical level, elitism seems to be based on exclusivity. The fact that not everyone can be elite makes being elite that much more powerful of a position once it's achieved, since it is based on skill, connections, and perhaps pure luck at certain times, like being at the right place at the right time. Therefore, wouldn't improving social mobility, the manner in which individuals can move up in social status, doesn't that just undermine the current elitist structure? Because structurally, how could this even be resolved into opening up the elitist structure to others? For example, looking at how the development of superfamilies who marry within their own similar cohort of skills and influence only secures the elitist structure. So then can we necessarily pass laws then that would prohibit elites from concentrating their powers amongst themselves and thus prohibit the continued development of superfamilies? Because this would surely be an inconceivable idea for a state to dictate who their citizens can and cannot marry and make a family with if the aim is just to produce a more egalitarian society and make the elite structure more inclusive. Elites are, after all, the most skilled in their fields. Let's take that into consideration. And if they know that their skills will eventually see a limit in power, might this discourage many elites from becoming skilled professionals and even halt progress in their field because of that? Potentially, then this makes it that the elite class that would be halted from bringing advancement to their fields would then likely cease to exist if there are limits to advancement in terms of motivations that motivates the elites to even create and innovate in the first place. Now, this isn't to say that all great advancements and innovators were from selfish people who only wanted money or power. But today, where that is the prominent driver of elites and advancement in society, removing that would risk both the elite class from existing and advancement in technology or media in a way. So by trying to abolish the elitist system in an effort to give everyone more opportunities, and enhance social mobility that would provide individuals across society these opportunities at a more inclusive level just might be undermined, and it might undermine what it means for individuals to even move up in social status, because there would be no set path to secure influence and power in society, because everyone is equally disposed of receiving these opportunities just as much as they are equally disposed of not receiving these opportunities. So we can say making a new group of elites, that would be the better option, but this doesn't necessarily resolve the problem of exclusivity and inequality of opportunity. Looking at this historically, perhaps the closest situation that resembles this might be the transition from the feudal age into the capitalist age, where the royal courts and nobility became less influential as the managerial class and bourgeoisie were becoming. So additionally, we must look at the elitist structure as a method of mostly accurate simplicity in the distribution of opportunities. Elites are also picked not entirely on a basis of discrimination to those without the privileges that the elite have, but also because there might be so many options that choosing those from the elite class carries a sense of stability in a sea of overwhelming options. Looking into something like job opportunities, with so many college graduates and people of the same levels of education today applying for the same type of work that were not of the same levels as before, maybe even 20 years ago, looking to elitist signals like having attended a high-ranking school or having experience in a higher position, even if it was thanks to something like nepotism, is the theoretically more promising choice over someone who did not have those. It shows that this person already understands the class that they will be joining, and thus makes it more likely they will do the elitist job coming from an elitist college or have the credentials of fitting in with those who already excel in society. And we can't underestimate the security of concentrating opportunities with the elite and upper middle class from this understanding. This is not to defend it, but just to acknowledge that that is a very valid understanding of that. So from the given points about why the elites exist and run our society, is the elitist structure should not be perceived as inherently wrong, when a more egalitarian system would perhaps provide the same level of social mobility or lack thereof, in which there would be no security in status. Motivation, in that case, motivation to advance the society might be lower, and thus advancements and breakthroughs that come from the highly skilled of society would probably decline. So this was just me speaking in more of a analytical, trying to be neutral approach, but this isn't to say I believe this, that elitist structure needs to exist this way. This is just how I approached my understanding of elite structures. It seems like you need to work within the system because they're going to exist. Otherwise, if you have none of it, there really won't even be any motivation to do much. There won't even be any advancement, and perhaps it would see a decline. So that's just my understanding of it, not necessarily to defend one point, but just to show my understanding. So another point I wanted to highlight is Owen Jones, the author of the book highlighted in the end of the chapter on elites. And Jones provided some truth in his claim that elites have a fundamental right-wing stance, at least in certain contexts, in maintaining their privileges and unequal status in society. I think that's a quite on par definition of what it means for elites to exist. So recall my point on the nature of elites and how they only exist as a result of exclusivity, where only the privileged few can enjoy the high position. The conservatives' essential point on inequality and how it is seen as a natural benefit of society, especially in terms of competition, as Thatcher highlighted, plays into the position that elites have of benefiting from having more than the rest of British society, and thus would align themselves more with the right-wing Conservative Party. Although the Labour Party has gradually become more moderate, especially from the removal of Clause 4 under Tony Blair, this party still strives for equality, especially for workers, and would go against the elite's protected privileges in society. So we should recognize this point as it is also prevalent in American politics, where Republicans promote the open market of capitalism, which doesn't always offer an equality of outcomes, instead of providing an intended equality of opportunities. And the Democrats support the open market too, but call for guardrails and some social safety nets to institute a more prominent level of equality than their Republican counterparts. But this doesn't mean that all elites would then promote right-wing politics only as the conservatives or the Republicans outline, especially when the term elite is actually such a loaded term that has been used nowadays to refer to even non-right left-wing politics in the anti-institutionalist context. In one way, elites are not entirely on the right wing of politics, including on certain social rights, as some will be open to same-sex marriage legalization. But on the other hand, right-wing politics is not all elite. The right wing of politics is not all elites, as we can see from the Brexit referendum that working class people have been and still lean towards the right-wing politics of securing their nation's borders. This is even prevalent in other countries, that we have seen the eruption of anti-institutionalist politics who take aim at the elites, including the elections in Argentina and Japan. The elites in those countries, regardless of if these elites are truly the accurate source of frustration for the issues that many blame them for, The elites are not framed by the American, British, Argentine, or even Japanese examples as being the problem simply because they are from the right, but only because they contribute to the institution that they seek to disrupt. Which for many organizations like the Tea Party in the US or Leavers in Brexit had actually promoted right-wing policies to remedy the issue of elitism rather than the opposite one, which Jones kind of proposed, which would be left-wing politics and more progressive policies. So these policies the policies that these right-wing, almost grassroots but from the people organizations promote are about protecting national sovereignty and even reducing the scale of government. Classic right-wing politics right there. What is interesting about these policies is that these have been the result of democratic change. Yet they continue serving the right wing and essentially some elitist interests that now have the backing of the people, i.e. the Tea Party, whose acronym Taxed Enough Already was a movement composed mostly of ordinary Americans who fought against high taxation on them, which in turn also supported elites on the same interest of conserving their wealth. Therefore, it can't entirely be argued that the remedy to elitist frustration would be left-wing politics, when in fact the policies of protecting Japanese national sovereignty and introducing austerity measures under Javier Milei were similar to the solutions Jones called for, but were for the inverse right-wing interests. This could then be evaluated through two perspectives. The first, that the elites have somehow infiltrated the populist surge and anti-institutionalism to be one step ahead of left-wing policies in places like the UK and the US by making the people think that the left is the real elitist base. And in a way, we can see this in effect in how Donald Trump, a billionaire from the American elite class, somehow became the popular figure of rising up against the elites. But we can also see this in a second perspective, which is that perhaps right-wing interests, even though they are backed by elites in many liberal democracies, are also simply the more powerful democratic interests that rally up the people to demand in favor of. In the US, for example, the socially liberal attitude that is expressed in Ivy League universities like Harvard aligns more with the left-wing causes of supporting LGBT plus rights and introducing DEI measures. Because Harvard is an elite institution, the elites then end up looking like they come from the left of the political spectrum. And in that case, shows accuracy and where elites versus popular interests lie when many Americans who have never had the privilege of being able to attend Harvard are told to be as open to diversity as Harvard exercises on its campus and curriculum. So from this, it looks like the right-wing politics are not entirely in support of the elite, just like left-wing politics are not entirely against the elite. Because at least since Jones's book's publication, the concept of the elite seems to also encompass some left-wing policies, and thus makes the anti-elite dynamic that is playing out not something we can easily identify as anti-right, but as I recalled in one of my previous analysis videos, there is a restructuring of right-wing and left-wing politics that will mean that in the midst of the anti-institutionalist politics that are unraveling right now, we'll cast elites in this battle to see who is the source for the people's frustration. So the role of single figures and political parties, as the book outlined, and actually from what I also related this to with the general simplicity of information being conveyed to the public nowadays, is that there is a trend of simplicity becoming a more relevant way to provide voters an understanding of a political party, as opposed to its ideologies as used to be the norm that was expected of voters before. We can see in daily speech in the United States and in countries like here in Argentina, where political parties are most well illustrated and synonymously used with the leader of the party. Even when I record my videos, I find myself using the name Javier Milei over his party La Libertad Avanza, or Donald Trump over the Republican Party. This is based on a mix of situations, with Milei's example where his party was made after becoming president, and Trump's where he has essentially been reshaping the Republican Party in his own unique way that departs from the traditional republicanism since his nomination at the 2016 Republican National Convention. But both cases prove that there is a restructuring of political parties in liberal democracies where the leader is becoming the helmsman of their respective parties' policies. The masses engage more with these single figures, it seems, as they are not likely to take the time to read and understand the standpoints of political parties, as we have seen in this age of massive information available to the masses. I can point to the example of the Republican Party's, I think it was 2012 or 2014, convention, or just their manifesto basically on what they were promising in their outline. No one really read it, but when the Chinese government was seen reading it and it was a whole issue that people were unsure of, the Republican Party someone from the Republican Party just commented jokingly, like, "I'm just glad somebody read it," to show that not many Americans or really regular citizens are interested in the ideologies of parties as much as simple facts. So regardless of their validity, as saying Trump is the Republican Party, that's much more of an easier way that many people understand it. Rather than just saying the Republican Party, people just simply say Trump. So as lower attention span activities are becoming more commonly adopted, including the growing trend of scrolling through 3 to 5 second reels on apps like TikTok, eye-catching and simple concepts are becoming the norm for voters to also get their political information. This can also be seen in how central figures of political movements use sensationalism, like how Trump has harnessed it to work well in his benefit by continuing to get the public to pay attention to him, regardless of if it's good attention or not, by bringing the public attention to his sensationalist political topics or just sayings, whether it results in support or backlash, regardless of how accurate the claims are. It goes with that phrase, all press is good press, essentially. Who knows if this social trend of seeking the most brief and striking of information with as little detail into the logistics will prevail as a common habit in this digital age where we have access to an overwhelming arsenal of information. But at this moment, this is the way people engage with content, including politics, and should be considered to be harnessed appropriately for any political party or movement's benefit. If they want voters to support them by using more simple central figures and key concepts of their party or movement, rather than expect them to follow the traditional method of having ideology be the face and expecting supporters to also necessarily have party allegiance to not only vote for them exclusively, but to consistently keep voting for them every election cycle. Regardless if this is a positive or negative sign we are seeing develop in human behavior, it is nonetheless a substantial factor of information sharing that we see expressed in the phrase, Trump did this, rather than, according to XYZ source, Congress has full authority to execute the 1920 Act. That type of phrasing, it just loses voters from paying attention to the big picture. So even if the big picture is necessary for voters to understand before sharing this type of information, they just like simple things like Trump declared war. It's that simple. Now, this isn't to say that this type of accuracy should be abandoned, as I am in full support of journalistic and political sciences' efforts in providing nuances to these complex topics, as that is what I am doing with my video format. But I instead want to shed light on what I have seen, what has been the tried and true method of compelling voters to vote for political parties, at least compared to other parties, and how these types of, in supporting all their parties, policies, and all the types of causes, as has been exemplified in the UK, the US, and many democratic countries, especially that can use social media to get these messages across. Thank you for watching this video, and I will see you guys in the next one.